Really excited for our next session of the day that is enhancing learning environments with AV over IP. So let's go ahead and bring on our guests. Joining me for this is Jeremy Caldera, Annie Foster, and Jimmy Singleton. Welcome, you guys. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having
Thanks.
us.
Great to be here.
So before I jump in and just start hammering you guys with questions, I wanted to let you guys just go around and each introduce yourselves, talk about who you are and what you do for a couple minutes. So Annie, do you want to start us off?
Sure. My name is Annie Foster. I live in Lexington, Virginia, working at Washington and Lee University. We're a small university. And prior to that, I was in Pennsylvania working in higher ed. I've been here about 3 years, and currently we are working on a capital project building that we are going to be installing AV over IP. So this seemed like a perfect opportunity to talk about it.
That's awesome. Jimmy, what about you?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Jimmy Singleton. I am the manager of state and local education at AVISPL. I cover North America, but I'm based in Southern California. I used to work in higher education. I was at the University of Southern California, where we did a large AV over IP rollout. So this conversation topic popped up, and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about what I did then, and then what we're talking about now with universities all over the country.
Very cool. Jeremy, how about you?
Yeah, I'm Jeremy Caldera with Pearl Technology. We're an AV integration house and focus a lot on higher education and just do a mountain of AV over IP work. So happy to be here.
Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and say to our audience that if you guys have any questions throughout this, I will pepper your questions in between my own. So feel free to ask those at any time. I like it when you guys participate. So first of all, I'm just going to throw this out to anyone who would like to start. So what is the current state of AV over IP in classrooms today, and how would you describe it?
I can start on that one.
Go ahead.
I talk with a lot of universities all over the country, and it's a little bit different everywhere we go of what people are actually using it for. I think when when I was working in higher ed, it was like AV over IP. We can send AV anywhere we want, anytime we want, and it's like that's cool. And then we put it in, and then we were like, when are we actually gonna send it to another room? Like what's the actual use case there, right? So I think that portion of actually sending signal over IP was not as big as we were hoping for. But then it became, more of like, are we just replacing a matrix switch with a network switch in a classroom? How much remote monitoring can we get out of it? How much data can we pull from putting things on the network? So we see a lot of kind of, as we talk with different universities, it's, everyone's kind of got a different plan. Unless they're doing like broadcast, they may not be sending it really over IP. They're just replacing equipment that used to be in room with putting it on a network switch instead.
And that's my experience too on campus. Selling the cross campus classroom to classroom solution is less of a selling point. And so we're really focusing on what can it do within one classroom and how can we extend the capabilities of that classroom. And it seems like, there's a lot of options there with USB switching and reporting, like Jimmy said.
I think I agree. I'm seeing that as the 90% use case, right? Keeping it internal, like you said, just replacing the matrix switch with the network switch. But a lot of what I am seeing, though, is overflow situations within buildings. So you're not necessarily moving data or video or content across the campus, but you are moving it across the building itself. A lot of that just has to do with bandwidth, network requirements, things of that nature. And, with Zoom and Teams and everything else that we've got going on, there's easier ways to move data and video across the campus at much more reasonable costs now. So, like I said, I'm definitely seeing it classroom to classroom, but those overflow situations are coming up more and more when it comes into collaboration between classrooms and things of that nature.
That's a good point. So when an institution decides that they want to adopt AV over IP solutions in their educational environments, what technical considerations should they keep in mind?
I think
Jimmy, you want
network
to?
team.
Yeah, I was gonna
Yeah,
say you want to start us off again.
I was gonna say, making sure that you're like best buddies with your network team. That's probably the biggest part of this, right? Is you're asking a lot of infrastructure, and making sure that there's enough space available, there's enough switches available, there's enough bandwidth available. It's not something that should be taken lightly or done quickly, right? You can't just say flip a switch and say I'm going to do AV over IP tomorrow and not tell anybody. So I would say, having that relationship with the network team and then asking them specifically, and trying to bridge that gap between AV and networking and say, hey, do we have enough to handle what we're trying to do? And then it comes back down to that use case of like, are we really sending it within the building? If we are, then maybe we need more. Maybe if we're just keeping it within classrooms, maybe we can get away with smaller switches or whatever it may be.
I'm finding a lot that we're keeping the AV network closed, right? So the only thing that's really touching the corporate network or the classroom network, if you will, of the university is really a port for management, remote diagnostics. Sometimes we're taking the wireless video presentation kind of stuff because it's got to integrate with WAPs that are existing in the building for the student network and things like that, so we can do collaboration presentation. But that's really the only stuff that we're, most of the time we're putting on the network, right? I think we really are trying to keep that isolated because we can control that quality of service. We can control everything that has to happen, the required PoE, the required bandwidth. There's just a lot that goes with that. But yeah, I mean, definitely make friends with the IT department. That's the big thing because you're going to have something on the IT network. But I'm just finding more and more that it's more closed than anything else.
Yeah. Along the lines of what Jimmy was saying, I start all of my processes when I'm like trying to figure out what to put into a room with the question of, can it do what we're currently doing? And so that's where I begin and make sure that we're not adding any interruptions or complications to the system. Definitely don't want any delay involved. And so that's what I'm looking at. I am working with the networking team, whether I'm going to choose to go with their network switches or my own. I'm still going to rely on them for their expertise in that area. And so building that relationship is really, it's what I'm focusing on right now.
That's important. So when it comes to AV over IP, do you guys think, in your opinions, that it has potential to create a more immersive learning environment? And if so, do you think that that could potentially enhance collaboration between students and teachers, kind of creating this like very ultra low latency environment? Or do you think that it doesn't matter?
Well,
I
the
would
word
say it's getting
immersive is
there.
very subjective, right? And
Yeah,
how
that's
that,
actually true.
I mean, how do you apply that, right, within a situation? Because when you think of more immersive stuff, I think more collaboration than I think immersive, unless you're talking about some kind of super specialized thing. And in which case, AV over IP is just going to be a transport method. And you're going to want to make sure there's
Yeah.
no latency, there's none of this other stuff that's going to go with that. But, you know, is it going to make it more immersive? I don't know. Like I said, that's a subjective thing we can talk about, but it definitely enhances the collaboration between everybody, because especially when you start bringing in wireless devices and things of that nature.
Yeah, I was gonna say kind of a similar thing. It's a great point, Jeremy. But like the ability to add multiple screens and like I think we saw the active learning classroom a long time ago, and they were like, just put wheels on chairs, and now it's an active classroom. And that's not what makes an active classroom, right? It's more about the pedagogy behind it and stuff like that. So if you have this room that's unlimited scalability, right? We can add multiple displays, and we can put we can put endpoints wherever we want to put endpoints. Then maybe it becomes more immersive in that fact, but I think it becomes more collaborative for sure. And being able to have people move around and do things at different stations with different groups of people and working together, whether it's wireless sharing or they all have their own screen or their own shared screen or whatever it may be.
Well, and maybe it's related to immersive, but I think of more accessibility. I think the options for making our content and our teaching environments more accessible are easier to achieve with AV over IP.
That's a really good point. Um, in terms of scalability too, I think that that's another important thing, and I think that that's a big selling point for AV over IP, and that's kind of a keyword that a lot of people tend to gravitate toward when they're talking about, the pros of AV over IP versus other options. So, how can AV over IP, in your opinions, support those growing educational demands across like giant campuses, multi-site institutions, where scalability in terms of like potential growth could be an important kind of selling point?
At my institution, it's kind of hard to ask for money for a hot swap that's going to sit on the shelf. So especially when it's a $15,000 hot swap. So for us, it's pretty obvious as soon as you do the math and you show the people, the stakeholders, that well, this is only going to be a $1,500 investment that's going to sit on the shelf. It's just an easy yes at that point.
Yeah, and I would say too, like even inside of a classroom, right? I think like I said, like you you add one projector when you start, but then classrooms change and they want to add 2 more TVs on the side walls. I think that becomes a lot easier, right? It's not like, well, we have to get rid of the whole matrix switch that's in the closet because we ran out of outputs on it, and we have to, and then we have a perfectly good matrix switch that sits somewhere else, or maybe we reuse it somehow. But it's just, let's add an endpoint and run a cat cable. To that other place. And then, campus wide, I think it helps with standards, hopefully, right? Moving building to building. If you can say, well, we've already done it over here, and all we have to do is recreate it when we move over to this new building that's going up, or capital project that's happening.
Yeah, that's a good point. Having like standardizing on one product that you don't have to relearn, you don't have to retrain, you don't have to recall whenever you go into a different room and it's a different DSP. It takes time away from the teaching and learning, which is what we're supposed to be supporting, to relearn how to make a modification in a room. And so, yeah, standardizing is huge.
Yeah, I think scalability is critical for AV over IP. I mean, the beauty of it is, unlike the old HD-based T days where you could cap out your matrix switcher with so many inputs and outputs, you kind of don't have that limitation anymore. You're not having to replace the entire back end just to add 2 more displays or 2 more sources. So although you might be paying a little bit more up front, it just really, at a certain point, it becomes more cost effective as well, right? So it's not only a better product and more scalable, but it is actually more cost effective. So, I definitely see that as being one of the biggest things that's a bonus for this. So.
Yeah,
That's
and I think
actually
too, like
fair.
the cost side of it, the the data management and data collection too. I think IT's done it for so long, right? Like they've been monitoring networks for years and years, and I think AV's done it at some level, but maybe not at the level that we'd hope to do it. So I think that helps sell that idea too of like, it puts it more in an IT term. So when you're, presenting a budget to an IT leadership, it's I think a little bit easier to sell AV over IP in that sense.
So, to Annie's earlier point about accessibility, so as we kind of see AV over IP potentially become more widespread in education for the reasons that you guys laid out, so how can institutions balance that innovation with accessibility and ensuring that technology actually enhances inclusion rather than creating barriers? That's a really hard one. I'm sorry that I just like threw that to you guys. I was like, answer it quickly.
It's a good question. Whenever we talk accessibility, it's oftentimes in higher education, it becomes a afterthought, which is unfortunate, and shouldn't be the way it is. But it does come up at the end of the conversation most often. So as far as like inclusion and all that, I think it comes down to like, we talk meeting equity a lot for anything virtual learning, right? Like, is everybody included in it? Does everybody have a say? Does everybody have a seat at the table? And then as far as, endpoints in a classroom, Are we talking about assistive listening on AV over IP? How much are we including that in? Is that the first step in every classroom, or is it in a closet somewhere that they have to bring out every time someone asks for it? All that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of layers to it, but I think the point being that it really should be the first question that you ask before even saying here's what we're going to do in the building. Is like, let's make sure we hit this bare minimum of where we should be, and then anything we do on top of that is great and amazing, and we can do more.
Well, that's where it comes down to standardization, right? When your enterprise is working on standardization, that makes things a lot easier, and not having to have that attic stock like you were talking about, or just a bunch of gear laying around. You just want to have everything accessible to you. You want to have it so it's quick and easy deployment, quick and easy learning curve. Like you said, Annie, you want to go back to what you're doing, which is teaching, and not having to worry about fighting the technology just to get going every day.
Yeah, and we talked about building relationships with network team. I think also this is where building relationships with the pedagogical leaders on your campus is really important, and making sure that they're training the teachers in a way that complements the technology. I loved the document cameras during the pandemic, but I am ready for document cameras to go away and for people to start using wireless devices and writing notes on wireless devices, so that they can be shared a lot easier.
Yeah. And I would say too, like along with the pedagogical team, there's a lot of campuses have accessibility teams, right? Like things that we're not thinking about as tech managers most of the time, that they think about a lot more often because they're getting requests for it. There's an interesting thing about like assistive listening, that if someone has to ask for assistive listening, they're like 90% likely to not ask for it, because it makes them feel like they're outed, by going up to your teacher and saying, hey, can you wear this separate pack for me and I'll put headphones on in the back. Whereas if they can, scan a QR code and, connect it to their device that's already connected to their hearing aids or whatever it may be, they're a lot more likely to do it. So things like that, that I just don't think we think about as often unless we're affected by it.
That's fair. That's a fair point. So what you guys also brought up a lot was that in order to build this entire AV over IP system, you're going to have to really collaborate closely with your IT team. So how can educators and IT professionals, in your opinions, collaborate effectively to ensure that those AV over IP systems implemented are truly going to enhance those teaching and learning outcomes? It's another hard one that I just was like, here you go, enjoy.
I think a lot of the collaboration has to happen with the educators, right? It's not just the IT team. It's the people who are using the systems, because we'll find that some people are just old school and they're stuck in their ways. They don't want to learn technology. They
That's
hate
fair.
technology. Some embrace it, but you're going to have this wide gamut of instructors at any campus that are either going to full board go in and figure out how to use it, and you're going to have some that aren't. So anything we can do to make the technology easier and coordinate with IT and just make life simple is going to make adoptability that much better. And that's kind of critical to the whole thing, because the last thing you want in a university is students going from one instructor to another instructor, or one class to another class, and utilizing the same technology, even though it's a standard, completely differently, right? So there's that I think that needs to happen more than coordination with everybody is important, but especially with IT. But I think the coordination with the instructors and the end users is the most critical point here.
I'm finding that we're having to take a step back and kind of define assumptions within my team, and then define assumptions within the networking team, because we're coming at this from two totally different angles, and my understanding of what I need is very different than their understanding of what they need. And so really kind of approaching it in a kind of scholarly way. If anybody else has other suggestions, I am open to them, but that's where I'm at right now.
I've seen some really good success with like people who have liaisons on their team in a sense, and it doesn't work for every university, right? Everyone's got limitations on how much staffing they can have and stuff like that. Um, but I know there's plenty of universities that hire, a network admin for their AV team, because they just need someone who can have the conversation and knows how to talk to the networking team, beyond the white papers that we get from the Trons of the world, and we try to hand those over and say, read this and tell us what you think. Then I think we end up just not on the same page about what we both want after the fact. But to Jeremy's point too, there's plenty of other teams too that have to get involved from the pedagogy side, that if you can go and put in as much technology as you want, but if no one wants to use it, then there's no real point to having it all in there.
So we got a question in from an audience member. This is from Gavin. Gavin asked, looking at the scalability that AV over IP brings to the table, what would you say would be the tipping point to decide to start designing an AV over IP solution for a venue compared to sticking with legacy HD-based T solutions where they might meet the pedagogical needs of the venue for now? How do you get academics to embrace a more high-tech pedagogy?
Speaking from experience, I would say I'm really doing the math on each space that I'm evaluating for AV over IP. I think if it's like kind of a wash in the end, then throwing in like, okay, well, if we want to have this room up 24/7, we're going to need a hot swap, and that'll be a $15,000 expense on top of that, or a $1,500 expense, helps to tip the scales.
And I will say on the pedagogy side of things, getting them to embrace this kind of technology, I think comes from the students a lot too, of what they're expecting. Students are coming out of a K-12 classroom that they've had an interactive flat panel for the last 12 years of schooling, right? And they've spent time walking up to that and using it and writing on it. And then they go to college and it's, 300 people in a classroom staring at a blackboard and one person talking for an hour. Is it really any different? That then the students are like, well, I could have sat at home and done this class on Zoom, right? I didn't get any personal inclusivity in this class. So then they review and then they want more, and student expectations go up. And then I think faculty expectations are raised by student expectations because that's their customer. And then hopefully they're willing to change, but working with the instructional technology team and making sure they understand what's going into classrooms so that they can train faculty on what they should expect when they walk into a room.
I think in an ideal world, everybody's forward thinking and they want the latest and greatest. In a more realistic world, you really just got to, for me as an integrator, it comes down to the sales team properly explaining the pros and cons of the old school way and the new way of doing things, right? But when it all comes down to it at the end, it's all dollars and cents, especially when it comes to educational institutions. So if you can not only explain the differences and the reasoning why you should be going this way, if you can have numbers to back that up, like Annie was saying, that's what's gonna sell this every time, right? And it's not, even if it's more expensive up front, if you can come up with numbers to say, hey, what's my long-term ROI, right, on this? That's what's going to help. So.
Yeah, that's good advice. So as we see more institutions potentially adopting AV over IP for distance learning, what are the key privacy and security concerns that educational institutions should be aware of, and how can they mitigate these risks?
Well,
That's another
a
really
distance
hard one.
learning standpoint anymore, we're using third-party platforms, right? So we're relying on any encryption security that they're going to be providing, which is far better than it was back in 2020, right? When you heard of the random people dropping into classrooms on Zoom calls and stuff, right?
Oh, yes.
But we're going to start to see that more and more. For me, the concerns for securing things have less to do with distant learning type applications and more to do with securing your network, right? Securing the devices that are on your network so that you're not going to, I don't want the AV equipment to be the reason why, 30,000 students' confidential records and social security numbers were leaked out to everybody, right? So I think understanding how the importance there is going to be more vital than encrypting or securing your far end stuff, because we're going to rely on the Microsofts of the world and stuff like, the Zooms of the world to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So.
I would agree with that. I think, yeah, the goal is to not be the one that causes the problem, right? With any security concern in a university or any corporation or whatever it may be. Changing the password from admin to something else that's a little bit more of an IT standard. But I think that's where it comes back to IT versus AV standards, right? Like, the great part about AV standards is there's so many to choose from. There's no real set limitation on it. Where I think IT's always had a little bit more of like the ITIL practice and a little more standardized on the way they approach, security and privacy concerns within, actual hardware units. But I agree with Jeremy completely. Like, Zoom's got, the HIPAA side of it covered, right? It's not on us if we use Zoom and something happens with Zoom. It's kind of about mitigating risk as much as possible where you can.
Well, and from my campus, hearing from lecturers being concerned about, like, where is this going? Like, my audio is getting recorded, the camera's in the room pointing at me, where is it going? And convincing them that we're not recording at all times is one thing. But I think what the benefits of AV over IP, where you can switch USB devices to a host computer, that gives them the control to know what's happening. If they see that device ending up on their laptop, maybe it's a little more reassuring that they have control over their intellectual property that they are presenting in the classroom.
That's a really good point. I think the intellectual property one pops up all the time, right? Where people are like, you're gonna sell my lecture and then you won't need me anymore, and and then I'll get fired or whatever it is, which I don't think has ever been the goal of recording.
It's like a lot of work to want to do.
I think I've heard that like once or twice, and then it just that seems to have died off, that mentality lately, I think. So
one could hope,
I hope so. I mean, I haven't seen it as much. I definitely saw it a couple of years ago, but not so much now.
I mean, everyone's being recorded some way or somehow. So
yeah,
I think most people have probably gotten over. But yeah, when lecture capture first came out, it was like, they're trying to take my job, I was like, I don't think anybody wants to
like, who is they in this question? Like, answer that first.
None of us have time.
AI, it's all AI.
I saw iRobot once. I know all I need to know. So this is kind of an experience-based question. So what are some of the most significant technical challenges you guys have encountered when implementing AV over IP solutions in educational settings, and how did you overcome them? You can think on that for a second if you need to.
I got a whole Rolodex of that.
Great. We're ready.
Yeah, I mean, for me, a lot of it has to do, on the very fundamental level, where we are working one-on-one with like data contractors, right? So we're working with the people now, because we're not necessarily going in. Like before, we would install the cabling for HD-based-T, but now I'm relying on the other low voltage and data contractors to install and certify the cabling that I'm going to use to jump onto the backbone to do the video over IP infrastructure, right? So ensuring that you're working closely with those contractors is critical, because if they don't do something correctly or put the wrong cabling in or do something like that, then you're going to constantly be battling, quality of service. That's going to be a huge thing from just like the physical side. Like physical installation of cable is going to lead to quality of service issues down the road. So that's a lot of where I see my issues. Other issues come from the manufacturers. I won't throw anybody under the bus, but a lot of it just seems to be like, oh, this next firmware will fix this, or oh, this, so there's just constant firmware updates, constant, ensuring of uniform firmware between devices for, communication. And I think we actually spend more time updating firmware and troubleshooting signal flow over the network and through a network switch. Same amount of time doing that as we do the physical installation of a job itself anymore, which is unfortunate, but and I'm hoping that it's going to start getting better. I see that a lot of manufacturers, I think, sometimes release stuff earlier than maybe they should, certain software updates and things like that, and that's causing some of those issues. But ultimately, the ones we work with get it done and we get it fixed. But it's kind of all over the board what those problems could be. But communication's key, no matter who you're working with. If it's the IT team, if it's the data contractors, if it's the manufacturers, it's whatever. It's whatever you need to get, whatever you need to do, whoever you need to talk to get the job done. So.
Yeah, I'll say from the integrator side, I think I've had plenty of experience on the university side of, the network team and, fighting back and forth. And then we end up buying lunch 100 times just to forgive each other. But I think for the integrator side, I think capital projects are probably the ones that we as integrators, I think we get, we win a bid and we go in and we design a building and we know that they want to do AV over IP, but maybe it's a Crestron on campus and we spec Extron or whatever it may be. Because we might not have that relationship with the actual on-campus AV support team, but we won the bid with the general contractor kind of thing. So I would say, we've learned a lot in going back to the actual AV campus support team after we win a bid and say, hey, just want to make sure you're the one supporting this after the fact. Are you okay with what we're doing? Just so that we're not, going against the bid and, getting in any sort of legal trouble, but also making sure that the customer afterwards doesn't go, well, I hate X integrator because they did this new building and it's not what we wanted it to be, because maybe they didn't have a seat at the table with the architects or something like that. So kind of helping bridge that gap from the integrator side to the actual, AV support team on campus.
Jimmy's telling my story. I think one of the things that I'm noticing is that the definition of roles is kind of unclear at this stage that we're at. We don't know who necessarily is responsible for pulling the cable, and we have to have those conversations. Who's pulling the cable? Who's terminating it? Who owns it in the end? If there's a problem with it, is it the network team? Is it the AV team? And just trying to kind of come up with a whole new set of standards.
Kind of like a new frontier in a way, like a whose problem is this to solve?
Listen, that's not a new frontier. That's a thing that's been happening for years, and it's going to continue to happen for years, unfortunately. So.
That's fair. Sorry. So we had another question come in from an audience member. This one is from Jennifer. Do you guys recommend that someone who is a tech manager meet regularly with IT and the professional teaching team?
100%.
I think it's always a good idea. I mean, everybody, if the tech manager is staying up with current technology, on the AV front, your IT team staying up with current technology on the IT front, especially with what both are doing throughout a campus, it's always ideal for them to talk to each other, because then when it comes to doing that implementation and not wanting to have those problems between integrators or bids or campus or capital projects, you're one step ahead of and maybe there's a lot less lunches in there if they're regular instead of makeup lunches, right, Jimmy?
Yeah.
The more conversations you have, the sooner the better it is. So
saving money.
Yeah, I would say we had, when I was at USC, we had, lunches with our IT teams pretty often, and just making sure we were all on the same page of what's going on. And I think it was easy to get. AV team was generally the one that's on campus, right? So like IT team was 3 blocks away in another building, and they'd send us an invite for an all hands meeting, like during finals week, and it's like, no, it's the wrong time. Like, are you out of your mind? We're not gonna be off campus during that time, because if problems happen, we need to be here to fix it, kind of thing. So I think there's a huge value in sharing those relationships, and then if you have a network person who's helping you, ask them if they want to go to InfoComm with you that year or whatever. If you have the opportunity to take them to a show and kind of share ideas and practices from both sides of the house, I think that helps a lot too.
So for my integrators, how do you ensure that AV over IP deployments in educational institutions remain, and I know you guys love this word, future-proof, especially with like advances in technology and like changing academic needs and any other random changes that come in there?
I don't know. It's hard to future-proof anything, but
I knew you were going to say that.
Helps with that, right? Here we've got a network standard that everybody uses. So I think the improvements we're going to see in recent in coming years is going to be just improved stuff, improved PoE, improved speed, improved reliability, improved all of, integration. But as long as, if you've got some high bandwidth cable installed and you're not working on Cat 5e infrastructure or something like that, you might start to see more stuff go fiber, depending on how you're sending it. It might be infrastructure upgrades, but I love snowballing and thinking about future stuff, but it's hard to do it these days stuff just changes literally so fast, right? This is a lot of what we're using today I would have never envisioned using 7-8 years ago. So
yeah, I think everyone wants to be bleeding edge, and then by the time the building's done, the bleeding edge is no longer bleeding, right? It's like there's 10 other things. Annie, you can probably talk about with your capital project, but I'm sure whatever you spec'd day one is probably not still the spec, or still maybe current as most current option available.
Yeah, I think my project started in 2019. I forgot what I was going to say. What were we talking about?
So next question, what do you guys, so like when you are outlining this to, the IT team at a university and are saying like, yes, this is the way to go, and you try to offer them some long-term cost benefits to just really make it clear that this is the way to go. When we've talked about scalability, have we talked about potentially the ease of maintenance, energy efficiency? What are some other like long-term benefits that you guys try to make clear?
I think the environmental side of it's kind of an interesting one. I think I see that more and more on bids. We have an entire team that does ESG reports and stuff like that. That they're really focused on making sure that we're explaining what we're doing, and how what we're installing is going to be the most eco-friendly possible thing at the time, and then how do we address those concerns in the future. But I think with a lot of AVoIP over IP, I think people get a little weary about the subscription costs that come with it. And, but that's where we can kind of push back to the maintenance side of it. It's like, yeah, there is a subscription cost, but here's the 10 things, 100 things you're getting for that subscription cost, and how it's going to make your life, X times easier after the fact.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The whole subscription model, there's a lot of old school people out there that aren't really adopting that yet, but they're coming around. There's definitely some cost benefit to that. And that is the biggest shocker that I see when it comes to us giving costs to anybody, when it comes to remote management, maintenance, monitoring, that kind of thing. But there's definitely a benefit there to that. And, how do you explain it to them? You got to kind of read the people that you're talking to in that case. But, I think that just overall, when it comes to, like we said, scalability earlier, working with a network standard, that's been in place forever is going to make things a lot easier. If something breaks down the road, there's going to be hopefully easier replacement parts, right? Versus, I keep going back to like HD-based switchers, right? Your switcher dies. Now you might have to change out all your endpoints too, where that might not be the case. When you're dealing with AV over IP, a lot of the stuff is more integrated together when you're talking about brands and product and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of proprietary stuff out there, and it's still good. There's a lot of interoperability as well. So.
Well, I'm looking at the impact to the classrooms in terms of maintenance. So it's much quicker for me to go in and replace one endpoint than it is if I have an amp die that's integrated into a switcher controller. How long is that room going to have to be down before I can get a replacement versus this one piece of the puzzle that can be swapped in 15 minutes, maybe, right? So I look at that kind of maintenance and think that it pays off pretty quickly. And if you calculate the amount of class time that is lost.
That's fair. So, how does the integration of AV over IP actually affect the role of these traditional AV pieces of equipment that are in educational spaces? Do you guys think that we're eventually going to move toward a fully IP based future? Or do you think that we're going to continue to kind of be in like a weird hybrid model for some time before we fully see that?
It's almost there now. I mean, honestly, we're seeing, the biggest hurdle to entry for an all IP solution is number of ports on a switch, in my opinion, because our microphones are all PoE IP. Our speakers now can be PoE and IP, and all monitored and all managed. So our endpoints. I mean, there's multiple times. We just did a whole campus upgrade where I don't think there's anything analog in the entire signal chain. I think there's one piece that's the traditional assistive listening system. We still got the Wi-Fi portion of it going on, but to meet the ADA requirement, you still have to have that traditional RF. And so those devices, at least the ones we used, didn't have a Dante jack in them, so they had to convert still analog. That's the one 6-inch piece of analog cable we had in that entire system. So I think it's there. I think audio, video, or IP is there. It's just that you're going to start to see the costs come down on it, which is good. Again, if you have it's just number of ports. The bigger your ports, the bigger your port count on these switches that need a lot of management for a lot of bandwidth, that can add up very quickly. So your switch cost goes significantly higher when you do that. So my hope is that in the future, right, we're going to start seeing a lot of that cost come down, and that stuff managed a little bit easier.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. I think the cloud is being pushed so heavily right now. Everything's cloud forward, and I think the only thing that's growing are the data racks in the building across the street, kind of thing, and I think the endpoints are getting smaller in size. They're getting more efficient. They're, taking up less bandwidth, all that kind of stuff. They're coming down in cost. So I think you'll see less hardware. I think there's always some portion of hardware, right? We still want displays on the wall and stuff like that, unless everybody's wearing like a headset of some sort. But I don't think we're quite there yet. But we're getting there.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I think we're going to be there.
That actually leads me to an interesting question that I actually had. So, what role do you guys see cloud technology playing in AV over IP deployments, and how do you think that also affects educational institutions that are looking to scale like their digital infrastructure?
I like the cloud the most just for remote management portion of it. I think that's probably the most exciting piece to me. I ran the support team, so I was sending student workers to run across campus as fast as possible to solve problems, because when you lose 10 minutes of class time, that's X amount of dollars that is lost in tuition, and we have to remember, at the core, universities and colleges are run off of student tuition. That's how they stay in business. So anytime we can avoid any sort of downtime, I'll say when we made the switch to more cloud-based processing and stuff like that, we had a lot more access to touch panels remotely, and we could solve problems over the phone by talking people through it, rather than sending a student to run as fast as possible and lose 10 minutes. And if we go past 15 minutes, then class might as well be canceled, kind of thing.
Well,
so
be careful when you say cloud-based processing, right? Because I'm with you on the remote management part, 100% on board with everything you're saying. But interestingly enough, I'm very against cloud-based processing, if you will, when it comes to like DSP infrastructure and architecture and things of that nature, because it kind of goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning, which is we're still finding that we're isolating our networks in a lot of cases, right? A lot of times we're still not being able to touch the public network or the campus network. Might have to do with security, might have to do with just infrastructure requirement, whatever that may be. But there's products out there now that require a license to be activated every time it turns on, right? And so if you don't have that access, or it's rare that the internet goes down at a whole campus, right? But let's say it does. I've had that happen in small businesses before, and then something can't activate. Now you can't use your room because the cloud's down, or whatever that might be, so there's some interesting things that are kind of there that have been there the past couple of years that we're morphing into, that we just kind of got to tread cautiously as we integrate these things into our designs and our ideology when it comes to campus standardization. So, but yeah, 100%. I mean, I can see the remote access and remote rebooting and all that stuff that's where like we have seen a huge return on everybody's investment right there. I mean, a lot of these systems will pay for themselves just when it comes to that amount of time that they're saving.
Yeah, we're taking advantage of the remote monitoring and even some remote configuration changes currently with our 10-year-old technology. I think I want to maintain that for sure. I'm not sure that sending large amounts of data to like the outside cloud makes any sense for us. Keeping it localized on our campus network is probably as far as we'll ever go.
So, what role do redundancy and failover systems play in maintaining uptime and reliability for AV over IP in some of these critical education environments?
I think it's critical for any space that is like a new building that's gone in, right? Where you're using shared resources for control, monitoring, DSP architecture and horsepower. Now we're using systems it's one unit that's the complete control system and DSP for 30 classrooms, right? And so if that one unit fails, you've got to have some redundancy. And you can get crazy with redundancy. I mean, I've got clients where we're actually doing network redundancy as well. That's a little bit more rare. It's a little bit more costly. That's more like government type stuff that we're seeing. But definitely like the main componentry, if you will, not necessarily endpoints. You can always get replacement endpoints. But if your core architecture goes down, then you got to have redundant backups. Even when it comes, I mean, not just power supplies, but units themselves. So
I think it's a great question. And I've been surprised at how unprepared a lot of manufacturers are for this question. When, a lot of these systems require one brain, one unit, control unit to control the rest of them in order to make integration much easier. When you ask about like, what about failover? It's not built into the system. And so that's something that then has to be kind of thought about and figured out. And it's also something that we don't feel confident in until we're actually already running in the classrooms and we've tested it.
I would say we already do it with power, right? Like we have redundant power in just about every space in every network closet and stuff like that in case that happens. But it doesn't always translate down to the actual hardware a lot of times, especially when you're going cloud forward and you have one core piece of technology.
I'm very surprised how many manufacturers are not thinking about this, right? Or not taking this approach. There's some out there. There definitely are. But even some of the really popular ones that we all know, they're not there yet. So
yeah, and the excuse I always hear is, well, the licensing makes it complicated, right? And that feels so weak if I'm going to be integrating it into a classroom where uptime is critical.
Yeah. So, question, which obviously I'm going to ask a question, but what are some of the most innovative uses of AV over IP that you guys have seen in education, and how did you see them impacting teaching and learning?
I'm a big fan of like medical simulation. I've used that a lot in MedSim. Just being able to take camera systems and pull them into any kind of recording software, do live talk back into actors or into the students and pull stuff down quickly for debrief in classrooms. And that's the best examples I've seen of AV over IP, where in a classroom situation you're moving stuff kind of all over a building for that purpose. I've also seen some really cool stuff in like the culinary institutes where we're using a lot of AV over IP. So that gets kind of neat when you're talking about working in cooking equipment and trying to hide equipment that's not going to die from heat and still works and is compatible with all of our other stuff. You can get pretty creative in the educational world when it comes to that kind of stuff. Experiential lobby design things are fun too. If you find a school that's got the money or a sports program that wants to do some fun stuff like that.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. We do a lot of experiential design, and I think that the simulation kind of falls under that. I think esports is a really cool play for it. Of sending signal anywhere all the time, especially for like overflow, if you want people to watch or, be able to see what's going on. I think it's a really cool way to add to that experience outside of the standard classroom. I think there's plenty of fun in a standard classroom, but I think there's limitations too.
I'm looking forward to seeing more examples.
Fair. So you guys have kind of mentioned this already, but as we're kind of starting to wind down here, what advice would each of you offer to educational institutions looking to transition from traditional AV systems to AV over IP?
Selfishly, I would say talk to your integrator partners. I think there's some value in making sure that you're on the same page. And I think to Annie's point, we talked about maybe it's going through a general contractor, so there's no relationship at the university level, and then there's just not a connection there. And I think really it comes down to like just how many stakeholders can we get on the same page to make sure that we're all talking and communicating. And obviously there's going to be things you run into and issues that come up during the project, but how can we make sure that we mitigate those issues or address them very swiftly?
It's interesting. Like I want the stakeholder buy-in from everybody, but I don't want too many cooks in the kitchen too, right? So, everybody's got an opinion, and everybody's opinion is the most important. So, how do we sift through that? I think that before you start developing any kind of campus standard, we do a lot of trial and error kind of test rooms, right? Where I might bring a couple different technologies to the table and let those things play with them, see how you want to do it, spend the time and do the research before you ultimately go down a rabbit hole that you regret 6 months down the road.
Yeah, I agree. Spend the time.
So one of my last questions also, and this is something that you guys have brought up, but just again, as we're winding down, kind of like final thoughts, how do you see AV over IP technology evolving in the next 5 years? And what innovations in particular do you foresee impacting the education sector?
I think I just see more use of in-room peripherals to user devices in a variety of ways. My ideal presentation would be bringing my phone and plugging it in and having everything be able to run off of my phone, a small device that fits in my pocket. And I think that AV over IP is the most ready, staged to accomplish that.
Yeah, I would agree.
The technology will go, right? I mean, it's going to get better in that kind of realm. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I always heard from faculty and like, I want to walk in, open my laptop, and that's it. I want to be done. And I'm like, that's great. I would love that too.
Well, if you can get their buy-in to actually understand how that works and what they need to do to make that work, I mean, we can only simplify it so much, right?
So much, but they're like, no, I just want it to work. Can't it just work?
It just goes, yeah.
That is a beautiful thought. That is a beautiful thought. Maybe one day that will be something that actually exists. Do you see any innovations? I mean, kind of not so much 5 years, but maybe 6 months. Do you see anything big in terms of technology that might change the game? Or is it just kind of like inching along, slowly becoming more into, the greater vernacular and like becoming more user friendly?
I'm seeing improvements on what we got, not so much, earth shattering new stuff.
Right.
I'd love to see that, but I just haven't seen that recently.
Yeah, I would say that too. I think AI is like the big buzzword of every conversation, and it's like, is it being is it being used at a university level? How do they want to approach it? Are they trying to not cheat, or are they trying to embrace it? And, it's already in the cameras that we install in the classroom and stuff like that. So how can we convince people that they want to use it more, or use it to their advantage as a tool rather than a bad force?
All right. So my last question for all of you is going to be, what are your final thoughts? What is the one thing you want an audience member who is watching this to take from this conversation? Annie, why don't you start us off?
Spend the time and do your research and maximize the benefits.
Jimmy, what about you?
I would say partnerships, like develop as many partnerships with the people you need to work with as possible. Whether it's people installing it or the manufacturers, friends from other institutions that have done it successfully, talk with them and figure out, what pain they went through and how can you avoid some of that pain. Because there's a lot of great resources out there available.
Jeremy, what about you?
This entire past hour.
just watch it. Just
everything we touched on is critical to any kind of implementation of AV over IP. But if there's one thing to take away to not duplicate any of what the previous people said, it's coordinate and communicate with end users and IT.
Yeah, that's beautiful advice. And my actual final question for each of you is, I'm going to go around and ask each of you, where can they contact you or your company's places of business? Annie, why don't you start?
I can be found on LinkedIn at Annie Foster, as in AN and the body part, knee, Foster. Community.hetma.org. You mentioned HETMA earlier. Thank you for the shout out. Or on X at in_a_skirt.
Perfect. Jimmy, what about you?
I'm on LinkedIn, just Jimmy Singleton, just my name. And then you can always email me at jimmy.singleton@avispl.com, or you can reach out to any of your AVISPL reps, and they're glad to connect you.
Perfect. Jeremy?
Jeremy.caldera@pearltechnology.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn as well.
Perfect. And yes, for all of you watching, you can scroll down to the headshots of all of our presenters here. And if you click on their name, it will take you directly to their LinkedIn pages. So we made it nice and easy for you to connect with these guys. So thank you guys so much for joining me on this panel. I had such a good time getting to pick each of your brains. And thank you for teaching me and our audience a lot about AV over IP and education.